It was a quiet Tuesday morning in a small-town courtroom in rural Georgia. The air inside felt heavy, thick with tension and the faint smell of old wood polished too many times. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room. People sat stiffly on wooden benches, some curious locals, others there out of obligation. But no one could have guessed what would happen next. At the center of it all stood an elderly black man, his posture as straight as a soldier's, despite his age. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his dark suit fit him perfectly, though it wasn't flashy or expensive. He carried himself with a quiet authority that made people sit up just a little straighter when he spoke. This was General Elijah Carter, retired from the U.S. Army after decades of service, but today, he wasn't here to talk about war or strategy. He was here to testify in a civil rights case. The case involved a young man who had been wrongfully arrested during a traffic stop. According to the report, the officer claimed the kid resisted arrest, but witnesses said otherwise. They described how the young man was pulled over for something minor, a broken taillight, and ended up face down on the pavement, handcuffed within minutes. It wasn't the first time this particular officer had been accused of targeting people based on their race, but this time someone decided to fight back. General Carter wasn't directly connected to the case, but his reputation preceded him. He'd agreed to testify because he believed in fairness, in standing up for those who couldn't always stand up for themselves. And so, when his name was called, he rose slowly, adjusted his tie, and walked to the witness stand. Every step seemed deliberate, like he wanted everyone watching to know he wasn't afraid. The officer at the heart of the controversy sat at the defense table, fidgeting nervously. He was younger than Carter by at least 40 years, with a square jaw and broad shoulders that filled out his uniform nicely. To anyone looking at him, he looked every bit the picture of authority. But beneath that polished exterior lay anger that simmered whenever things didn't go his way, anger that sometimes boiled over into actions he later regretted. As Carter began answering questions from the prosecutor, his voice was calm and steady, each word measured. He recounted what he'd seen during the incident, sticking strictly to the facts without embellishment. That's when the officer snapped. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" The officer blurted out, interrupting mid-testimony. His tone dripped with disdain, loud enough to echo off the walls. The judge slammed her gavel down hard, demanding order, but the officer ignored her. Sitting there acting all high and mighty, like you've got some kind of right to judge me, Carter didn't flinch, not even a twitch. Instead, he turned slightly in his chair, meeting the officer's glare head-on. "I'm not here to judge you," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I'm here to tell the truth." That response only fueled the officer's frustration. Rising halfway from his seat, he leaned forward aggressively, pointing a finger toward Carter. "You need to show some respect," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. By now, murmurs rippled through the crowd, heads turning back and forth, between the two men like spectators at a tennis match. And then it happened. Before anyone could react, the officer stormed across the courtroom, closing the distance between them in seconds. Without warning, he raised his hand and struck Carter across the face, a sharp, stinging slap that echoed through the room like a gunshot. For a moment, everything froze. Time itself seemed to stop as gasps erupted from the audience, followed by stunned silence. Carter blinked once, twice, but other than that, he gave no outward sign of pain or shock. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and touched his cheek where the red mark was beginning to form. Then, fixing his gaze on the officer, he said softly, almost to himself, "Respect isn't given, it's earned." The officer froze, suddenly realizing what he'd done. His bravado crumbled under the weight of his own reckless actions. Panic flashed across his face as he took a stumbling step backward, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every second of the scene while phones were already recording videos destined to go viral. In the days that followed, those few moments in the courtroom would spark outrage nationwide. Protesters would take to the streets holding signs demanding justice. News outlets would dissect every detail, debating whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. And yet, none of them, not even the officer himself, knew the full story of the man they were dealing with. The courtroom erupted into chaos the moment the slap landed. Gasps turned into shouts and people scrambled to their feet, pointing fingers or covering their mouths in disbelief. Phones were held high, recording every angle of the scene as if everyone instinctively knew this wasn't just another day in court, it was something bigger. The judge's gavel came down again and again, her voice sharp but drowned out by the commotion. "Order! Order in the court!" she demanded. Though it was clear order had already been shattered. The officer who'd thrown the slap stood frozen, his face pale and his hands trembling. He glanced at Carter, then at the crowd, and finally at the judge, as if trying to figure out how to undo what he'd just done. But it was too late. The damage was done and there was no taking it back. His eyes darted toward the door, perhaps considering a quick exit, but he stayed rooted to the spot, trapped in the storm of his own making. Carter, on the other hand, remained eerily calm. He didn't raise his voice or retaliate. Instead, he slowly lowered his hand from his cheek, where the red mark of the slap was still visible. For a brief second, his expression hardened, not with anger, but with something deeper, almost like disappointment. Then, without saying a word, he straightened his tie and sat back down in the witness chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried. It was as if he knew this moment would define more than just himself. It would ripple far beyond these four walls. Within minutes, the video footage began spreading online. Someone had uploaded it to social media, and within hours, it went viral. Clips of the slap played on repeat, accompanied by captions like "Cop assaults elderly witness in court" and "Why did this happen?" People couldn't stop talking about it. Was it racism, abuse of power, or just sheer arrogance? Theories flew across comment sections, hashtags trended, and debates raged late into the night. By morning, the story had made national headlines. News anchors dissected every detail, replaying the clip frame by frame while legal experts weighed in on what consequences the officer might face. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No, more police brutality." Some carried pictures of other victims of alleged police misconduct, linking this incident to a long history of grievances. Others simply stood silently, fists raised in solidarity. But not everyone agreed on what should happen next. While most condemned the officer's actions, some defended him, claiming he was provoked or misunderstood. Online forums became battlegrounds, with arguments spiraling into heated exchanges. One side accused the other of being blind to systemic issues. The other accused them of rushing to judgment without knowing all the facts. It seemed like the entire country was divided over a single slap in a small-town courtroom. Amid the chaos, whispers started circulating about the elderly man at the center of the controversy. Who was he, really? Sure, he looked distinguished. But why did he carry himself with such authority? Why hadn't he reacted violently when struck? Questions like these led reporters digging deeper into his background. At first, they found little, just public records of an older black man living quietly in the area. But as they kept searching, fragments of his past began emerging. Veterans groups were the first to speak up. On social media, retired soldiers and military historians began sharing stories about General Elijah Carter. They talked about his legendary career in the U.S. Army, his leadership during some of the toughest missions in modern history, and the respect he commanded even among those who disagreed with him politically. Someone posted a grainy photo of Carter standing beside a group of troops decades ago, his uniform crisp and medals gleaming under the sun. Another shared a quote attributed to him, "A true leader earns trust through action, not fear." As the pieces came together, the public realized they weren't dealing with just any witness. This wasn't a random elderly man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was someone who had spent his life serving his country, someone whose name once inspired awe and possibly fear in powerful circles. The revelation sent shockwaves through the internet. Commentators speculated about how the officer must have felt upon learning the truth. Had he known who Carter was before slapping him? If not, how would he react now? Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies scrambled to respond. Internal Affairs launched an investigation into the incident, reviewing body cam footage and interviewing witnesses. Federal authorities stepped in, citing potential violations of civil rights laws. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending further review, though many believed it was only a matter of time before formal charges were filed. For Carter, the days following the incident were surreal. Reporters camped outside his modest home, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or hear his thoughts on the growing scandal. But he kept a low profile, declining interviews and avoiding the spotlight. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved, often seen tending to his garden or taking long walks around the neighborhood. When asked about the case, he simply said, "Let the system do its job." Behind closed doors, however, Carter wasn't idle. Friends close to him revealed that he spent hours on the phone speaking with civil rights advocates, military colleagues, and community leaders. He wanted to ensure the incident didn't fade away as just another viral moment. It needed to spark real change. Some suggested he sue the officer personally, but Carter shook his head. "This isn't about revenge," he told them firmly. "It's about accountability." As the days passed, the pressure mounted on the officer. His identity was revealed, along with details of previous complaints against him. Former colleagues described him as hot-headed and impatient, while others claimed he harbored prejudiced views despite never voicing them openly. Regardless of his intentions, the evidence painted a troubling picture. Public opinion turned sharply against him, with calls for justice growing louder by the hour. And yet amidst the outrage, there was also reflection. Conversations about race, power, and respect bubbled to the surface, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. Could this have happened if Carter had been white? Would the officer have reacted differently? These questions lingered, unanswered but impossible to ignore. In the end, the fallout from that single slap in the courtroom stretched far beyond the individuals involved. It became a mirror reflecting society's flaws and a catalyst for demands for reform. But for now, all eyes remained fixed on the unfolding drama, and on the quiet, composed man at its center who refused to let anyone forget the value of dignity, even in the face of disrespect. The courtroom was packed again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just curiosity bringing people in. It was anticipation. Word had spread about the elderly man who'd been slapped, and now everyone wanted to know more. Who was he? What made him so special? And why did it seem like the entire world was holding its breath waiting for answers? The officer sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't slept much since that fateful day. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old man's calm expression staring back at him, unchanged even after the slap. At first, he'd tried convincing himself it didn't matter, that the man was probably just some retired schoolteacher or mechanic. But as the days passed and whispers turned into full-blown revelations, doubt crept in. Was he really who they said he was? If so, what had he done? The judge entered the room, her robe flowing behind her, and called the session to order. She wasted no time cutting through the noise. "We are here today," she began, her voice firm but measured, "to address allegations of misconduct and determine whether further action is warranted. Before we proceed, I've requested a private meeting with the witness to clarify certain details." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Private meetings weren't uncommon, but this one felt significant. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised over notebooks, while cameras zoomed in on Carter's face. Still, he gave nothing away. His expression remained neutral, almost serene, as if he were watching events unfold from a great distance. When the doors closed behind them, leaving only the judge, Carter, and a handful of officials in the room, the air grew heavier. The judge studied him. For a moment, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "General Carter," she said, finally breaking the silence, "I believe it's time you clarified your identity for the record." Carter nodded slightly, as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. Handing it to the judge, he said simply, "This should answer your questions." The judge unfolded the paper and scanned its contents. Her eyes widened slightly before she regained her composure. Without a word, she passed the document to the others in the room. One by one, their faces shifted, from confusion to shock, then to something resembling awe. When the last person finished reading, the judge looked up at Carter. "You're aware of the gravity of the situation?" "I am," Carter replied, his voice steady. "But let's be clear, this isn't about me. It's about accountability. About ensuring that no one, regardless of rank or position, is above the law." The officials exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. Whatever reservations they might have had about pursuing charges against an officer melted away in the face of Carter's credentials. This wasn't just any man. It was General Elijah Carter, a decorated 4-star general whose name carried weight far beyond the courtroom. Back. In the main hall, the tension was palpable. People whispered among themselves, speculating about what was happening behind those closed doors. Some guessed Carter was revealing secrets about his military service. Others thought he might be threatening legal action. No one could have predicted the truth. When the doors reopened and Carter re-entered the courtroom, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him as he walked slowly back to the witness stand. The judge followed close behind, her demeanor unusually solemn. Taking her seat, she addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, there has been new information brought to light regarding the witness, Mr. Elijah Carter. For the sake of transparency, I will share it with you now." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she announced, "Mr. Carter is not merely a civilian. He is General Elijah Carter, a retired 4-star general of the United States Army, widely regarded as one of the most respected and accomplished leaders in modern military history." The room exploded. Gasps filled the air, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, while spectators craned their necks to get a better look at the man who'd been sitting quietly among them all along. Even the officer seemed stunned, his jaw dropping as realization dawned. Carter stood motionless, allowing the chaos to settle around him. When the noise finally subsided, the judge gestured for him to speak. Rising slowly, he adjusted his tie and faced the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but commanding, filling the room like a gentle yet unyielding tide. "You see me as a black man," he began, his words deliberate. "Some of you may have seen me as weak, harmless, undeserving of respect. That's why this happened." He gestured toward the officer, who flinched visibly under his gaze. "But let me make one thing clear. I am not defined by assumptions. I am defined by my actions, my service, and my commitment to justice." He paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "This slap wasn't just against me. It was against everything this country claims to stand for. Respect, equality, accountability. You struck me because you thought I was nobody. But even if I had been nobody, it wouldn't excuse what you did." The officer sank lower in his chair, his face flushed with shame. Around him, people nodded silently, absorbing Carter's message. For many, it wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about the bigger picture. About how prejudice blinds us to the humanity of others. About how arrogance can lead us to underestimate those we deem inferior. As the hearing continued, the focus shifted entirely. The officer's lawyer tried to argue that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment, but the damage was done. Witnesses recounted previous incidents involving the officer, painting a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. By the end of the day, it was clear that his career, and possibly his freedom, was hanging by a thread. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Carter as he stepped into the sunlight. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, each journalist desperate for a soundbite. But Carter didn't engage. Instead, he offered a brief statement, his tone resolute. "What happened today isn't about revenge. It's about setting an Example: we must hold ourselves accountable if we want to move forward as a society. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a stunned audience and a nation grappling with the implications of his words. The story of the slap had taken a dramatic turn, but for Carter it was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. The courtroom incident had become more than just a local news story. It was now a national reckoning. People everywhere were talking about it, dissecting every detail, and debating what justice should look like in this case. For the officer at the center of it all, life had turned into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Every knock on his door made him jump. Every phone call felt like a threat. He knew there was no going back. By the time the trial began, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters, activists, and curious citizens filled every seat while others waited outside, holding signs and chanting slogans. Some demanded accountability. Others called for systemic change. The air buzzed with energy, a mix of anger, hope, and anticipation. At the heart of it all sat the officer, slumped in his chair, looking smaller than ever. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a weight dragging him down. On the witness stand, General Elijah Carter returned, calm and composed as always. This time, though, there was no mistaking who he was. Everyone in the room, from the judge to the janitor, knew they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. A man whose life had been defined by service, sacrifice, and unwavering principles. As he took his seat, the murmurs quieted, replaced by an almost reverent silence. The prosecutor approached him with careful respect. "General Carter," he began, "can you tell us how you felt during the incident?" Carter leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the railing of the witness box. "I felt disappointment," he said, his voice steady, but carrying enough weight to silence even the faintest shuffle in the room. "Not because of what happened to me personally, but because it reminded me of something deeper, a failure to recognize humanity when we see it." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The prosecutor nodded, letting the moment settle before continuing. "And do you believe the actions taken against you were motivated by prejudice?" Carter didn't hesitate. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself with loud words or obvious gestures. Sometimes it's hidden behind assumptions. The assumption that I was weak, that I didn't matter, that my voice could be silenced without consequence. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room until it landed squarely on the officer. But here's the thing about assumptions: they can blind you to the truth. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. His lawyer tried to intervene, asking the judge to limit Carter's responses to direct questions, but the damage was done. The jury and everyone else in the room was hanging on to Carter's every word. When it was finally the officer's turn to speak, he stumbled through his testimony. His voice cracked as he apologized, not just to Carter but to the court, to the public, to anyone who would listen. "I didn't know who he was," he stammered, his face red with shame. "If I'd known, if I'd understood, I never would have done it." Carter watched him silently, his expression unreadable. When the defense rested its case, the judge turned to Carter one last time. "Do you wish to make a statement before we conclude?" For a moment, Carter hesitated. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. The room went still, every breath held in anticipation. Standing tall, he addressed the court, not just the people in the room, but the millions watching from afar. "I've spent my life serving this country," he began, his voice soft yet commanding. "I've faced enemies on battlefields and challenges in boardrooms, but nothing has tested me quite like the fight for dignity. Dignity isn't given freely, it's earned through mutual respect. And respect isn't something you demand, it's something you show." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What happened here wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on values we claim to hold dear. Values like fairness, equality, and justice. If we want to live in a society where everyone is treated with respect, We must first confront the biases that divide us. As he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Even the judge struggled to maintain order, her gavel tapping repeatedly against the bench. Outside, crowds cheered, moved by Carter's words. For many, this wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a lesson in humanity. In the end, the verdict came quickly. The jury found the officer guilty on multiple counts, including assault and misconduct. The judge sentenced him to prison, stripped him of his badge, and ordered mandatory counseling. It was a harsh punishment, but most agreed it was deserved. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would take much longer to heal. For Carter, the outcome wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about sending a message, a reminder that no one is above accountability, regardless of their position. After the trial ended, he declined interviews and avoided the media spotlight. Instead, he focused on using the platform he'd gained to push for meaningful change. He met with community leaders, sharing ideas for reforming law enforcement practices. He spoke at schools, encouraging young people to pursue careers in public service while staying true to their values. And he worked tirelessly to ensure that stories like his wouldn't fade away as fleeting moments of outrage, but would inspire lasting progress. Though the officer disappeared from public view, his fate became a cautionary tale. Training programs across the country incorporated the incident into discussions about bias and professionalism. Officers were reminded that assumptions could lead to disastrous consequences, not just for themselves, but for the communities they swore to protect. For Carter, the real work was just beginning. The slap may have brought him into the national spotlight, but it was his response that defined him. Quiet, dignified, and resolute, he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he chose to rise above, proving once again that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in resilience. The trial was over, but its impact lingered like ripples spreading across a pond. For General Elijah Carter, life didn't return to normal. Not that he expected it to. Fame had found him in a way he never sought or wanted. Strangers approached him at grocery stores, thanking him for standing up not just for himself, but for everyone who felt powerless against injustice. Kids sent letters to his home, asking if he'd sign photos or share stories from his military days. News outlets begged for interviews, offering big checks and promises of global exposure. But Carter wasn't interested in any of that. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, making sure this moment wasn't wasted. He knew the slap in the courtroom could easily become another sensational headline, forgotten as soon as the next scandal broke. That's why he poured his energy into creating something lasting, a legacy rooted in action, not words. One of the first things he did was team up with local leaders to launch a foundation aimed at mentoring young people, especially those from marginalized communities. The goal was simple: give them tools to succeed while teaching them the importance of integrity and respect. "We can't fix everything overnight," Carter often said during meetings, his voice steady but warm. "But we can start by showing these kids they matter." He visited schools regularly, sitting down with students to talk about their dreams and struggles. He listened more than he spoke, nodding thoughtfully as teenagers opened up about feeling overlooked or dismissed because of their race, background, or zip code. When he finally offered advice, it came not as lectures but as stories, moments from his own life when he faced doubt, fear, or prejudice, and how he pushed through anyway. "Respect isn't given freely," he told one group of high school seniors. "You earn it by being consistent, by doing the right thing even when no one's watching. And remember, respect goes both ways. You have to give it to get it." His visits left a mark. Teachers noticed changes in behavior. Students holding doors open for each other, speaking kindly instead of snapping back, standing taller in hallways. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was progress. And for Carter, progress was enough. Beyond mentoring, Carter also turned his attention to police reform. He worked closely with advocacy groups, helping draft policies designed to address bias and improve accountability within law enforcement. His approach was practical, drawing on lessons learned during decades of leadership. Change doesn't happen because we shout louder. he explained during a town hall meeting. It happens when we sit down together, listen, and find solutions that work for everyone. Some officers resisted at first, viewing him as an outsider trying to dictate how they should do their jobs. But Carter didn't let pushback deter him. Instead, he invited skeptics to join the conversation, sharing examples of departments that had successfully implemented similar reforms. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Even hardened veterans admitted his ideas made sense. Behind the scenes, Carter stayed grounded. At home, his wife, a retired officer herself, kept him balanced. They spent evenings reminiscing about old times, laughing over shared memories and discussing the future. She admired his determination but worried about the toll it might take on him. "You've already given so much," she'd say gently. "Don't forget to take care of yourself too." "I'm fine," he'd reply with a smile, though sometimes she caught him staring out the window late at night, lost in thought. She knew he carried burdens heavier than anyone realized, but she also knew better than to pry. Instead, she supported him quietly, making sure he ate well, rested enough, and took breaks when needed. On weekends, Carter often drove to nearby veteran cemeteries, walking among rows of headstones adorned with American flags. He brought flowers, or small tokens of remembrance, placing them beside names etched in stone. These visits weren't just tributes, they were reminders. Reminders of sacrifices made, battles fought, and promises kept. Each grave represented a story, a life cut short or lived fully in service of others. As he stood there one sunny afternoon, hands clasped behind his back, a young soldier approached him. Dressed in uniform, the man saluted sharply before introducing himself. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. Not just recently, but your whole career. You inspire us." Carter nodded, returning the salute. "Thank you for your service," he said simply. Then, after a pause, he added, "Remember, leadership isn't about titles or rank. It's about serving those around you, lifting them up, and leaving things better than you found them." The young soldier nodded, visibly moved. As he walked away, Carter watched him go, pride swelling in his chest. Moments like these reminded him why he kept going, even when the weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders. Back in the public eye, Carter's influence continued to grow. Towns renamed streets after him. Schools dedicated auditoriums in his honor. Yet, despite the accolades, he remained humble. "This isn't about me," he'd insist whenever someone praised him. "It's about what we can achieve together." And together, they achieved plenty. Police departments nationwide adopted new training programs emphasizing empathy and cultural awareness. Community outreach initiatives flourished, bridging gaps between officers and residents. Statues commemorating civil rights heroes replaced monuments celebrating divisive figures. Change was slow, uneven, and imperfect, but it was happening. Through it all, Carter never stopped reflecting on where it had begun. That single slap in a small-town courtroom. What started as an act of disrespect had ignited a movement proving that even in darkness, light can emerge. For Carter, the journey wasn't about vengeance or glory. It was about hope. The belief that every person, no matter their past, has the power to shape a brighter future. As the months passed, the headlines faded and life moved forward, but the lessons remained, woven into the fabric of society like threads in a tapestry. And at the center of it all stood General Elijah Carter, a man who refused to let bitterness define him. Instead, he chose compassion, resilience, and purpose. Because for him, true strength wasn't measured by titles or medals. It was measured by the lives touched along the way. Months had passed since the courtroom incident, and the world had moved on to new headlines. Yet, for those who'd been touched by General Elijah Carter's story, the impact lingered, a quiet undercurrent shaping lives in ways that couldn't always be seen but were deeply felt. Change rarely happens overnight, but it does happen when people refuse to give up. And Carter was a man who never gave up. On a crisp autumn morning, Carter stood at the edge of a veteran's cemetery, the golden sunlight casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. He carried a small bouquet of flowers in one hand and a folded American flag in the other. This was his ritual, a moment of reflection he reserved for himself every few weeks. It wasn't just about honoring the fallen. It was about reminding himself why he kept fighting, for justice, for dignity, for the belief that even the smallest actions could ripple outward and create waves of change. He walked slowly down the gravel path, stopping occasionally to place a flower or straighten a flag that had been knocked askew by the wind. Each grave told a story, some of sacrifice, others of survival, but all shared a common thread: service. As he reached the final, he paused beside a familiar headstone. It belonged to an old friend, someone he'd served alongside decades ago. They'd laughed together, argued over strategy, and shared dreams of retiring to peaceful lives once their duty was done. But his friend hadn't made it that far. Cancer took him before he could see the world he'd helped protect grow into something better. Carter knelt, brushing away a few stray leaves from the base of the stone. "We're still working on it," he murmured softly, almost as if speaking directly to his friend. "It's not perfect, but we're getting there." For a moment, he allowed himself to sit quietly, letting the cool breeze wash over him. Then, rising to his feet, he placed the remaining flowers gently on the ground and turned to leave. As he drove home, Carter thought about how much had changed since that day in the courtroom. The officer who'd slapped him was serving time, stripped of his badge and reputation. To some, it might have seemed like poetic justice, a man brought low by his own arrogance. But Carter didn't see it that way. He saw it as a failure, a breakdown in the system meant to protect everyone equally. Punishment alone wouldn't fix what was broken. Real change required understanding, effort, and patience. And while the road ahead was long, Carter believed they were heading in the right direction. Back at his house, Carter settled into his favorite chair by the window, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His wife joined him, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf for charity. Outside, children played in the street, their laughter carrying through the open window. Life went on, simple and beautiful in its ordinariness. "You've done good work," she said after a while, glancing up from her project. Her tone was warm but tinged with pride. "People are starting to listen." Carter smiled faintly, sipping his coffee. "They're listening because they finally realize silence isn't an option anymore. We can't ignore injustice and expect it to disappear. It takes courage to face it, and even more to change it." She nodded, setting aside her knitting for a moment. "Do you think it'll stick? Or will things go back to how they were?" He considered her question carefully before answering. "Some will try to go back to the way things were. Fear has a way of making people cling to what feels safe, even if it's wrong. But I also know there are enough of us willing to push forward, enough of us who won't let this moment slip away." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They both knew progress wasn't guaranteed. It required constant vigilance. But Carter had faith in humanity's ability to rise above its flaws, even if it stumbled along the way. Later that evening, Carter attended a community event held at a local park. Tables lined with food, music drifting through the air, and families gathered under twinkling string lights created a festive atmosphere. At first glance, it seemed like any other neighborhood gathering. But this one was different. Organized by the foundation Carter had helped launch, it brought together police officers, activists, teachers, students, and residents, all united by a shared goal of building bridges. As Carter moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging smiles, he noticed subtle signs of progress. Officers sat side by side with community members sharing stories and laughter. Kids ran around wearing badges handed out by officers, their giggles echoing through the night. Even disagreements were handled respectfully, with both sides listening instead of shouting. At one point, a young boy tugged on Carter's sleeve, holding up a drawing he'd made earlier that day. It depicted two figures standing hand in hand, beneath a rainbow, one dressed in a police uniform, the other in casual clothes. "This is for you," the boy said shyly, thrusting the picture toward Carter. Thank you for helping. Touched, Carter knelt down to meet the boy's eye level. Thank you, he replied, accepting the artwork, for reminding me why we do this. When the event ended, Carter lingered for a while, watching as people packed up tables and said their goodbyes. There was a sense of hope in the air, fragile but undeniable. These moments mattered, not because they erased pain or solved every problem, but because they planted seeds of possibility. Driving home, Carter reflected on the journey so far. From the slap in the courtroom to the nationwide movement it sparked, everything had unfolded in ways he couldn't have predicted. He hadn't sought fame or recognition, yet here he was, leading by example simply because he refused to stay silent. Along the way, he'd inspired countless others to do the same, to stand tall, speak truth, and demand better. But Carter knew the fight wasn't over. Systems built on prejudice and inequality couldn't be dismantled overnight. Progress would ebb and flow. Victories would be followed by setbacks, and there would always be battles left to fight. Still, he remained steadfast. Because for him, leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about showing up day after day and doing the hard work required to make the world a little kinder, a little fairer. That night, as he climbed into bed, Carter turned off the lamp and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the future. He imagined a world where no one had to prove their worth based on skin color or background. A world where respect came naturally, not grudgingly. It was a dream, yes, but dreams had a way of becoming reality when enough people dared to believe in them. Closing his eyes, Carter whispered a single line to himself, as much a promise as a prayer. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And we'll keep earning it together. And with that, he drifted off to sleep, ready to wake up the next morning and start again.